I still keep the pharmacist's handwritten slip in the same drawer where the pill organizer sits, worn soft at the fold now from how many times I've checked it against a new bottle. Small thing to hang on to. It's just proof, I suppose, that somebody here took the time to make sure an old stranger got what he needed. And I like having a piece of that where I can see it. It reminds me strangers can still turn out kind more often than not. The rent notice was sitting on the table the same morning my Social Security check landed, and I watched both numbers at once. 4 hours later, the check was almost gone, and what was left wouldn't cover groceries or my blood pressure pills. I'd already sold the couch. I'd already sold Ruth's sewing machine. I had a one-way ticket to a city in the Philippines, bought 2 weeks before, and my daughter didn't know a word of it. Maybe that was the most reckless thing I've ever done. Maybe it was the only sane thing I had left to do. Before I get into how it all happened, if you're the kind of person who likes hearing stories like this one, real, messy, nothing dressed up, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It helps more than you'd think, and I've got more of these to tell. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit of mine, starting in the middle and working backward, same as I used to trace a bad weld back to the joint that caused it. So let me back up. 6 months, maybe a little more. I was still in the apartment on Federal Street then, the one I moved into after the house got to be too much. 31 years I put into that plant before it closed, tool and die, the kind of work where you learn a thing with your hands and it stays learned. I could still tell you, blindfolded, the difference between a die that was cutting clean and one that was starting to drag. After the plant went, I did 9 more years on a warehouse floor for a hardware distributor, nights mostly, until my knees told me that was over too. The younger guys on that warehouse floor used to razz me some, gently, about being old enough to be most of their fathers, and I let it roll off because most of them meant it kind, and because the alternative to being razzed by 25-year-olds was sitting home alone with the television on mute, which I'd tried and didn't much care for. Ruth was still alive for most of that. She'd been gone 6 years by the time any of this started, and I still made coffee for 2 most mornings out of habit before I caught myself and poured half of it out. I kept her chair by the window, even though nobody sat in it. I told myself it was for reading, but I never read there. Some mornings, I'd catch myself talking to the room like she was still going to answer, and I'd stop and feel foolish about it, and then do it again the next day anyway. That's grief for you. It doesn't ask permission to keep coming back. There was a photograph of the 2 of us on a fishing trip up in Ontario that sat on the nightstand, and some nights I'd pick it up and just look at it a while before turning the lamp off. Not thinking about anything in particular, just looking. The house before the apartment, the one Ruth and I raised both kids in, sold for less than we owed on the second mortgage we'd taken out to cover her first round of treatment. I don't like thinking about that house much. I drove past it once, maybe 8 months after we sold it, just to see. And the new owners had put up a fence where our garden used to be. And I sat in the truck at the curb a while before driving off without getting out. Some places you don't get to go back to. Not really, even if the address stays the same. I checked the mailbox the way some men check a scoreboard, dreading a name on an envelope. My landlord's management company had a habit of sending the rent increase notices in a plain white envelope, no logo, like they knew it looked less official that way. Twice in 18 months they'd raised it, both times citing market conditions, which is a phrase that means somebody decided you'd pay it because you had nowhere else to go. The first increase I absorbed by cutting things, cable, the extra data on my phone, a standing Friday breakfast with 2 other retired guys from the plant that I just quietly stopped showing up to without telling them why. I still feel a little bad about that, dropping off without explanation, like I'd decided my own company wasn't worth the $7 a plate. The second increase, I couldn't cut my way out of. I took on a part-time shift at a hardware store at 71 to cover the gap. Stocking shelves mostly, sometimes running the register when they were short. My back, let me know what it thought of that arrangement inside of a month. I'd come home and sit in the recliner with a heating pad and tell myself it was temporary, the way you tell yourself a lot of things when the alternative is admitting you're stuck. There's a thing I never told Karen, and I still haven't told her all of it, not even now. 3 years back, my son Tom came to me, needing $14,000 for a contracting business he was starting in Arizona. He had a business plan he'd printed out and everything spiral bound, like that made it more real. I gave it to him out of the 401k. What was left of it, after 2 rounds of unemployment, had already eaten most of it down. I didn't tell Karen because I knew what she'd say, and because some stubborn part of me still thought of Tom as somebody I was allowed to help without asking permission first. That's a father's mistake, maybe. Thinking your money is only your business, even when it isn't anymore. The business folded inside a year. A partner who ran off with equipment, a permit problem that ate the working capital. I never got the full story and stopped asking after a while because it hurt less not to know the details. Tom stopped calling much after that, more out of shame than anything, I think. I kept a bank statement in a drawer that I'd close fast if Karen came by, like she'd smell the number on it. She never asked. I think some part of her already suspected and didn't want to make me say it out loud any more than I wanted to. The Philippines came into it the way most big changes come into a man's life. Sideways, from somebody he wasn't expecting. Frank Delgado worked the line 2 stations down from me for 11 years. Good man, dry sense of humor, the kind of guy who'd hand you a tool without you asking because he'd already seen you were about to need it. He retired to Cebu about 2 years before any of this. We got on a video call one night, just to catch up, nothing more than that, and somewhere in there he turned his phone around to show me his balcony and mentioned, not selling it, just mentioning what he was paying a month, rent, food, the works. It was less than what I was handing my landlord alone. He didn't dress it up. He even said, "It's not for everybody, Walt," like he wanted me to hear that part too. And I remember being a little annoyed at the caveat, like he thought I couldn't handle it. I didn't decide that night. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to make it sound like one conversation changed everything, and that's not how it went. What happened was I started looking things up at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, which by then was most nights. Apartment listings with photos that all looked a little too good. Forums full of retired guys arguing with each other about visa rules, half of them contradicting the other half, so that I came away from most sessions more confused than when I started. A spreadsheet, if you can believe that, with columns for rent and columns for what happens if I get sick and don't have anybody there. I'd sit at that kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cold, working the numbers. And some nights, the numbers made it look easy, and some nights they made it look like the stupidest idea a grown man ever had. The hope and the fear sat right next to each other on that screen, and neither one of them won for a long while. I called Frank a second time, about a month in. More questions than the first call. What happens if you fall? What happens if the power goes out? What happens if you get robbed? All the things Denise would have asked if she'd known I was asking. Frank answered most of them plain, no sugar on it. Told me about a typhoon that knocked his power out for 4 days. Told me about a scam he'd nearly fallen for himself the first year. Some fellow selling him on a guaranteed investment. And I remember filing that away, without knowing yet how much it would matter later. It's not paradise, he told me. It's just cheaper, and it's got people in it who'll notice if you go quiet for a few days. Back home, does anybody notice that? I didn't have a good answer for him. I sat with that question longer than I led on to Frank, turning it over the way you'd turn over a part you weren't sure was cracked or just dirty. There was a third call, closer to when I'd actually started packing, where Frank asked me straight out if I'd told my kids yet. I told him not yet. He didn't lecture me about it, just said, "Don't wait too long, Walt." Told mine after I'd already signed the lease, and it took my daughter the better part of a year to forgive me for that part, even after she came around on the rest of it. I heard him. I didn't listen to him. Not really. Not until it was too late to matter. I started keeping a second notebook, separate from the spreadsheet, just for the fear side of things. Questions I didn't want to ask Frank outright, because I didn't want him to think I was already halfway gone. What if the money runs out faster than the math says? What if nobody notices if something happens to me? What if the kids never forgive me for going? I never showed that notebook to anybody, not even Denise, not even after everything came out into the open. The night I actually crossed the line, I didn't announce it to myself. I went out to the garage and started pulling the spare truck parts I'd been hoarding for a decade and put them up for sale online, along with Ruth's old sewing machine, the one she hadn't touched in the last 2 years of her life, but that I'd kept anyway, like it was evidence of something. Proof she'd been there, maybe. Proof the life we built together had actually happened. I told myself it was just extra cash. I didn't tell myself, out loud anyway, that I was funding a plane ticket. A man buys a plane ticket. He can't unbuy it without losing money on the fee. I understood that going in. I bought it anyway one night, fast, before I could talk myself out of it, and then sat there staring at the confirmation email like it belonged to somebody else. Karen found the boxes before I found the nerve to tell her. She came by on a Sunday with groceries she didn't need to bring. She'd been doing that more since Ruth passed, showing up with a bag of things I hadn't asked for, like feeding me was a way of checking on me without having to say she was checking, and saw the living room half packed and stood there in her coat not taking it off. "What's this?" she said. Not really a question. I told her I was thinking about a change. She said, "Thinking about it or doing it?" I didn't answer fast enough, and that told her everything. "You can't be serious," she said. "Dad, you don't know anybody there. You don't know the language. What happens if you get sick?" "People get sick here too," I said, which wasn't an answer, and we both knew it. "That's not the same, and you know it," she said. "Here I can drive over in 20 minutes. There I can't do anything. I'm 3,000 miles away doing nothing while you're, what, figuring it out as you go?" "I've been figuring things out as I go, since before you were born," I said, which came out sharper than I meant it, and I watched it land on her like a slap. "That's not the same either," she said, quieter now. "You had Mom then. You had a job. You had—" She stopped herself, and I understood the rest of the sentence without her finishing it. "You had all of it, Dad, and now you don't, and I'm scared of what that means for you out there alone." "You've already decided, haven't you?" she said, and I didn't deny it, and that was worse than if I had. We didn't resolve anything that night. She left angrier than I'd seen her in years, groceries still sitting unpacked on the counter, and I sat in the quiet after, with a feeling I couldn't name. Something between relief that it was out in the open and shame that I'd let her find out that way instead of telling her myself. I called Tom that same night, first time in months, mostly because I didn't know who else to call, and some part of me wanted somebody on my side. He listened, didn't say much, and near the end of the call he said, "You know I still owe you that money, Dad," out of nowhere, like it had been sitting in him waiting for an opening. I told him not to worry about it right then. I regretted saying that later, because it let both of us keep not talking about it a while longer. I sat at that kitchen table a long time after Tom hung up, looking at the boxes Karen had seen, feeling like a man who'd started something he couldn't fully explain, even to himself, let alone to the people who loved him. I thought about calling Karen back, apologizing for the sharp tone, telling her the real reason underneath all of it, that I was scared of ending up in a spare room somewhere, watched over instead of living. But the words wouldn't come, and I let the silence sit instead, the way I'd let too many silences sit over the years. The morning I left, I had one bag with a wheel that didn't roll right anymore, Ruth's wedding ring in a small box in my jacket pocket, and a phone that hadn't buzzed with anything from Karen since the Sunday she found the boxes. I sat in the airport thinking I should call her, and didn't, because I didn't trust what my voice would do. Somewhere over the Pacific, I pulled out my phone in airplane mode just to reread the last text she'd sent. 3 words long, and I won't repeat what it said here because it still catches in my throat some. I watched the seatback screen track the little plane icon crawling across an ocean I'd never crossed before. And somewhere around hour 9, I stopped feeling brave about any of it, and just felt old and far from everything I knew. Bacallad hit me the second the doors opened past customs. Heat that sits on you like a hand, fluorescent light bouncing off tile, a wall of drivers holding cardboard signs, one of them with my name spelled wrong by 2 letters. I stood there a second too long, bag in hand, feeling exactly like what I was, a 72-year-old man who'd never been further from home than a fishing trip to Ontario, standing in an airport 10,000 miles from anybody who knew his name right. The noise alone nearly turned me around. Announcements in 2 languages, horns from outside the doors, somebody's cartwheel squealing past. I found the misspelled sign and pointed at myself like an idiot, and the driver just smiled and said, "Close enough," and took my bag before I could argue about it. The driver, not Ricky, not yet, just a stranger with a van, took me straight to an apartment I'd only ever seen in photographs online. The man managing it wasn't there. Somebody else was, a broker who called himself Mr. Villanueva, smiling in a way that made me think of every man who'd ever tried to sell me something I didn't need. No lease, no paperwork I could read twice. Just a number and his hand out, and me standing there with a stack of cash I'd converted at the airport, telling myself I'd come too far to turn back over a little discomfort. I paid him. I didn't know yet whether that was the first smart decision I'd made in months or the first dumb one I'd make on this side of the ocean. I only knew I was standing in a stranger's apartment in a city I couldn't have found on a map a year before, holding a receipt that wasn't really a receipt, wondering what Karen would say if she could see me now, and grateful, in a small, ugly way, that she couldn't. I unpacked slow that first night, laying things out in the bed the way Ruth used to when we traveled. Everything in its place before you. Let yourself rest. Carol's, Ruth's, ring went on the nightstand, the only thing in the room that felt like it belonged to me. I lay there a long while, listening to sounds I didn't recognize yet. Dogs somewhere, a television through the wall, and thought about how strange it was to feel this alone in a place with this many people in it. Morning came in loud, not gently, loud, with a rooster somewhere close enough to sound personal, and traffic noise from a street I hadn't figured out the name of yet. The apartment looked smaller in daylight than it had in the photos Villanueva showed me, back when I was still in Ohio, talking myself into this. The kitchen was half the size I'd pictured. The window unit rattled like it was arguing with itself, I remember standing at that window the first full night, looking out at lights I didn't recognize, streets with names I couldn't have told you, and thinking that for the first time and longer than I could place, nobody in the world knew exactly where I was at that moment. Not Karen, not Tom, not a single soul back in Ohio. It should have frightened me more than it did. Mostly it just felt strange, like stepping off a curb you didn't know was there, and finding the ground anyway. I stood there running my hand along a countertop that had a crack in it nobody mentioned online, and I felt two things fighting each other: disappointment at what I'd bought sight unseen, and a strange, stubborn relief at the number I still owed each month, which was less than a third of what Federal Street had been squeezing out of me. I sat down that first morning with a pad of paper, same as I used to do at the kitchen table back home, and worked the actual math instead of the hopeful math I'd done at 2 in the morning for 6 months. Rent. Electric, which I was told ran high because of the window unit. Water. Food, once I figured out what things cost at the market, instead of guessing. When I added it all up against the check, it worked. Barely. There wasn't a dollar of cushion in it, nothing set aside for anything going sideways. And I sat there a long minute with the pencil in my hand, thinking about what sideways could mean for a man my age, in a place he didn't know yet. Some nights that first month, I'd lie there running the numbers over again anyway, out of pure habit, even after they'd already worked out fine on paper 3 times running. Old fears die slow, even the ones the math has already answered. I got lost trying to find the public market that first week. Ended up 3 streets past where I meant to be, sweating through my shirt, asking a stranger for directions in gestures more than words. She walked me half the way herself, instead of just pointing, chatting the whole time about her own father back in a province I couldn't place, and left me at the market entrance with a wave like it was nothing. I stood there afterward, trying to remember the last time somebody in Youngstown had gone out of their way like that for a man they'd never see again. I spent that first week mostly lost. I'd walk 2 blocks and lose my sense of which direction the apartment was in. I couldn't read half the signs. I stood in a little grocery for 10 minutes, once trying to figure out which of 3 unfamiliar brands was actually cooking oil, and finally just picked the cheapest one and hoped. Small things kept catching me off guard. The way the power would flicker without going out fully. The way everybody seemed to know everybody else on the street already. The way I felt watched even though nobody was paying me any particular attention. I wasn't used to being the one who didn't know how anything worked. 34 years in a trade where I was the man other men asked questions to, and now I couldn't even work a laundromat machine without help. I stood in front of that machine longer than I'd like to admit, pressing buttons at random, before an older woman folding towels nearby finally took pity and showed me which cycle did what. There was a man outside most mornings, mid-40s, leaning on a motorbike with a little sidecar rig, and the first few days I walked past him with a nod and nothing more, the way you'd walk past a car salesman you didn't want approaching you. His name was Ricardo Mendoza, though I didn't get the full name until later. And on the 4th day, he caught me standing outside a utility office, looking at a bill I couldn't make sense of, half in a language I didn't have, and half in numbers that didn't match what I remembered paying. "You need help with that?" he said, and I said no out of pure reflex. The same reflex that's cost me plenty over the years. He shrugged and said, "Okay," and didn't push, which surprised me more than if he had. It was 2 days later, and watching me squint at the same bill again, that he finally just walked over, took it from my hand, and explained it in about 90 seconds flat. A late fee I didn't understand. A meter reading I'd misread. He didn't ask for anything. I had a 5 ready in my hand, out of habit, and he waved it off like it embarrassed him. "Next time you're paying for the ride, not the favor," he said, and laughed like it was the easiest joke in the world. That's the kind of thing that sticks with a man who spent the last few years assuming everybody had an angle. Over the following weeks, Ricky became less of a driver and more of a fixture in my days, though neither of us would have called it that out loud. He'd stop by most mornings, whether I needed a ride anywhere or not, sometimes just to sit a few minutes and talk about nothing much. His own kids, a niece studying nursing in Manila, a cousin who'd gone to work on a cargo ship and sent postcards from ports neither of us could pronounce. I found myself looking forward to it in a way that surprised me. The same way I used to look forward to the Friday breakfasts I'd quietly stopped attending back home. The landlord I'd been half afraid of turned out to be a woman named Murray Tays. Tess, she told me to call her, who ran the building along with two others nearby. She showed up my first week to collect the deposit paperwork Villanueva should have handled, and never did. And when she found the discrepancy in what I'd been told versus what was actually owed, she corrected it in my favor, without me having to argue for it. I stood there in the doorway, half expecting a catch. There wasn't one. She just said, "Some of these brokers, I don't trust them either," and moved on to the next line item like it was nothing. Later she told me, almost offhand, that her own son worked construction in Dubai, sent money home twice a month, and that she understood better than most what it meant to be far from family and doing the best you could with what you had. I hadn't been treated like a person worth being fair to, not by a landlord, in longer than I wanted to admit. The blood pressure pills ran out on a Tuesday, and that turned into more of an ordeal than I expected. Back home, it was a phone call and a 15-minute wait at the pharmacy counter. Here, I didn't know the local name for the medication, didn't know which pharmacy would carry it, didn't know if what they'd give me would even be the same thing my doctor in Youngstown had been writing for 6 years. Ricky drove me around to 2 different pharmacies before we found one that had something close enough, and the whole time my chest was tight with something that had nothing to do with blood pressure. The specific fear of being an old man in a foreign country, with a body that needed things it might not get. The pharmacist there, a young woman who spoke better English than half the people I'd worked with back home, walked me through the dosage carefully, wrote it out on a slip of paper for me to keep. It worked out. I got the pills. I still keep the pharmacist's handwritten slip in the same drawer where the pill organizer sits, worn soft at the fold now from how many times I've checked it against a new bottle. Small thing to hang on to. It's just proof, I suppose, that somebody here took the time to make sure an old stranger got what he needed, and I like having a piece of that where I can see it. It reminds me strangers can still turn out kind more often than not. But that fear didn't leave when the pills did. Karen called that week, and it wasn't a good call. She'd heard from Tom. First, I'd heard his name mentioned by her in months. That I'd moved without any real plan. No address anybody had. No way to reach me in an emergency. I told her I had a plan. She said, "Do you?" Because that's not what it sounds like. I tried to walk her through the apartment, the rent number, the neighborhood, and she cut me off partway through. "That's not what I'm asking, Dad. I'm asking who's there if something happens to you." I didn't have a satisfying answer yet. We went back and forth, neither one of us landing anywhere, and she hung up saying she needed to think, which from Karen usually means she's already decided something and isn't ready to say it yet. "You keep saying you have a plan, Dad, but every time I ask what it is, you change the subject," she said. "That's not a plan. That's a hope." I didn't have a comeback for that one. I sat with the phone against my ear a long moment, listening to her breathe on the other end, both of us waiting for the other to say something that would make it easier, and neither of us finding it. I found something to do with my hands that week, which has always been the thing that settles me down when nothing else will. A neighbor 2 doors down, a woman named Elena with a stalled water pump, and a teenage son who didn't know a wrench from a screwdriver, asked if I knew anything about small engines. I did. Spent an afternoon with my hands in grease again, for the first time in years, tracing the problem back the way I used to trace a bad weld. And something in me came back online that had been dark a long while. It wasn't Charity. She fed me lunch after, insisted on it, sat with me on plastic chairs out front, while her son asked me questions about how the impeller worked, and I understood that in some small way I'd just paid my way into this place, instead of just occupying it. Villanueva found me again, near the end of that second week. Different pitch this time, an investment he called it, in a jeepney refurbishing operation a cousin of his was running. Put in some money now, get it back with interest in 6 months, guaranteed. I should have walked away the second I heard the word guaranteed. I even remembered somewhere in the back of my mind Frank telling me about the scam he'd almost fallen for his first year, and I let the memory slide right past me instead of listening to it. Instead, I sat there and let Villanueva flatter me. Let him tell me I had a good eye for opportunity, the kind of thing nobody had said to me in years, and some vain, hungry part of me that missed being taken seriously ate it up. I told him I'd think about it. He said not to think too long. Looking back, I think what made Villanueva's pitch work on me wasn't the money at all. It was the way he talked to me, like I was still the man who used to walk a factory floor knowing more than the engineers half the time, instead of a retiree stretching a government check. Nobody had talked to me like that since I'd stopped being useful to a paycheck. I've thought since about how cheap that flattery actually was, and how expensive I nearly let it get. I went home that night and did something I'm not proud of. I took the number he'd quoted me and started figuring out how I could pull it together, moving cash around, telling myself it was smart, instead of asking myself why a stranger needed my money for a business I knew nothing about. I was at the counter withdrawing cash the next morning, already halfway to handing it over, when my phone buzzed. A text from Karen. I glanced at it, saw Tom's name in the first line, and didn't open it. I told myself I'd read it later. I put the phone back in my pocket and kept counting the bills in my hand. I opened the text once I was back at the apartment, cash still folded in my pocket, undelivered. Karen had written more than usual, not her style, normally short and to the point. Tom had called her, she said, broke again, and in the middle of asking her for money, he'd let slip that I'd loaned him $14,000 3 years back and never told her. She wanted to know if that was true. She wanted to know what else I hadn't told her. She wanted to know if I was doing something just as foolish on the other side of the world where nobody could stop me. I called her instead of texting back, which I should have done from the start. "Is it true?" she said, before I'd even gotten a full sentence out. "It's true," I said. $14,000, Dad. That's... She stopped herself. "That's most of what you had left after the 401k took those hits. And you never said a word. I didn't want you to worry. I worry either way. The difference is, now I don't trust what you tell me." She let that sit a second. "Tom says there's some guy out there too, some broker. Says you've been talking about giving him money for a jeepney business." I hadn't told her that. Tom must have gotten it out of me in some earlier call I barely remembered, half guarded, half not. "It's not decided," I said, which was true and also a lie, because in my head it had been mostly decided an hour before her text landed. "You're 72 years old, and a stranger's asking you for cash in a country where you don't know anybody, and you're telling me it's not decided. Her voice cracked on the last part, and I heard something under the anger that wasn't just anger. I raised 2 kids on that salary, Karen. I know how to spot a bad deal. You didn't spot the one with Tom, she said, and the second it was out of her mouth, I could hear she wished she hadn't said it, but it landed anyway, and it landed hard because it was true. I got defensive instead of honest, told her I could handle my own money, told her I'd been handling money since before she was born. She said something back I didn't have a good answer for, and we hung up without either of us saying the thing that mattered, which was that she was scared for me, and I was scared she might be right. We're about halfway through what happened, and if it's hitting home at all, drop a comment and tell me. I read every one of them, and it helps me know which parts of this actually land. And if you haven't already, tap that like button. Costs you nothing, tells me a lot. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I did something I should have done before I ever handed Villanueva a peso. I asked Ricky about him straight out. Ricky's face did something complicated when I said the name. He asked around for me that afternoon, made a few calls, came back with a look I recognized, because I'd worn it myself plenty of times. Back home, when I realized I'd been had. No license. No business registration anybody could find. A cousin who existed maybe, but not a jeepney operation anybody had heard of. Villanueva wasn't new at this. He had a reputation, just not one he advertised. Guys like that find the ones who just got here, Ricky told me. You're not the first, Walt. Won't be the last either. I sat with that a good while. What got me wasn't the money. I hadn't handed over the investment yet, only a processing fee weeks earlier that I now understood I'd never see again. A few $100s gone to secure the apartment deal that never had proper paperwork behind it in the first place. What got me was recognizing the shape of it. Back in Youngstown, I'd let a landlord raise my rent twice without pushing back, without asking questions, without demanding anything in writing, because some old part of me still believed if you just kept your head down and paid what you were told to pay, things would work out. I'd done the same thing here, just with a different man asking. The Philippines hadn't done this to me. I'd brought the same soft spot with me across an ocean, and it had found a new man to exploit it. I spent a good part of that day thinking back to the plant, to a foreman I'd worked under my first few years, who used to say a man's word was worth exactly what he was willing to lose to keep it. I hadn't thought of that foreman in decades. It struck me, sitting in that apartment, turning Villanueva's name over with Ricky, that I'd let my own word slip cheap more than once in the last few years. With Karen about the loan, with myself about how bad the rent had really gotten. Maybe that was the real thing I'd carried across the ocean, more than any soft spot for a smooth talker. I called Villanueva and told him I wasn't in. He didn't take it well, said things about wasted time and opportunities that don't come twice, and I let him say them and hung up anyway. He tried a different tone once he realized flattery wasn't working anymore. Something closer to guilt, telling me I was letting down people who'd been counting on the investment to come through, cousins and friends I'd never met and had no obligation to. I recognized that move too, eventually, though it took me a beat longer than it should have. A man trying to make you responsible for strangers' expectations is usually trying to distract you from asking harder questions about his own. I thought sometimes in the weeks that followed about how easily that whole thing could have gone the other way. How close I'd come to handing a stranger money I couldn't afford to lose, on nothing but a good feeling and a hunger to be flattered. It humbled me more than the hospital visit did in some ways. A body failing you is one thing. A man's own judgment failing him at 72 is a harder thing to sit with, and I sat with it plenty in those first weeks after. Tess laughed a little when I told her about the whole Villanueva business, not unkindly, and said half the newcomers to the building had a story just like it somewhere in their first few months. You get used to spotting them after a while, she said, the ones who talk too fast about opportunities. Real ones don't need to rush you. I've thought about that line more than once since, applied it to more than just money. The lost fee stung. It wasn't ruin. I could still make the rent. But it wasn't nothing either, and it sat in my stomach like a stone for days. Elena invited me out to her family's place near Talisay the following weekend, a gathering for her mother's birthday. Half the barangay, it seemed like, crammed into a yard with plastic tables and too much food. I almost didn't go, old habit of mine, assuming an invitation like that was just politeness and not a real want. But Ricky told me flat out I'd be an idiot to say no, so I went. Spent the afternoon getting my ear talked off by an uncle who wanted to know everything about American cars. Ate more than I should have. Watched Elena's boy show off the water pump fix to anybody who'd stand still long enough to listen. Somebody handed me a plate before I'd even found a seat. Like feeding a guest wasn't a question anybody needed to ask permission for. Nobody there needed anything from me. Nobody was selling me anything. It was just a family, letting a stranger sit at their table because their neighbor had vouched for him, and I drove back that night. Ricky drove, on the back of his bike, feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to think about. 3 nights later, I woke up at 2 a.m. with a pressure in my chest I didn't like the feel of, tight across the front, my left arm heavier than it should have been. I sat on the edge of the bed a long minute, telling myself it would pass. The same stubbornness that had kept me from telling Karen about Tom's loan, from asking Ricky questions I should have asked weeks earlier. It didn't pass. I finally called Ricky, voice shakier than I wanted it to be, and he was there inside 15 minutes. No complaint about the hour. Got me on the back of his bike into the hospital faster than I think an ambulance back home would have managed in that traffic. The waiting room was fluorescent and full of people who all looked calmer than I felt. A doctor saw me within the hour, ran what tests they had, and came back with something less catastrophic than what I'd been imagining on the ride over. High blood pressure, badly out of control. Medication that needed adjusting. A warning that I'd pushed things further than I should have by letting the pills lapse, and the stress pile up without telling anybody how bad either had gotten. Not a heart attack, not this time, but close enough to it that it scared the truth loose in me. Ricky sat with me the whole time, filled out paperwork I couldn't read fast enough, translated when a nurse's English and my hearing didn't quite line up, and never once made me feel like a burden for needing him there. Somewhere in the middle of it all, lying on that gurney with a blood pressure cuff tightening on my arm, I thought about Ruth, about the hospital room where I'd sat with her those last weeks, about how strange it was to be the one in the bed this time, in a country she'd never seen, with people around me who hadn't known her at all, and yet were treating me like I mattered anyway. I called Karen from the hospital bed before I'd even fully processed what I was going to say. Told her everything, the loan to Tom, the near miss with Villanueva, the chest pain, all of it. No more editing myself down to the parts that made me look steady. She was quiet a long time on the other end. "I'm coming out there," she said finally. Not a question. I tried to talk her out of it, told her it wasn't necessary, and she cut me off. "It's not up for discussion, Dad." And underneath the firmness in her voice, I heard something else. She needed to see it with her own eyes, because she didn't trust my version of things anymore, and I couldn't blame her for that. The week before she landed, I did things I'm a little embarrassed to admit. Scrubbed the apartment top to bottom, even got up on a chair to wipe dust off a ceiling fan nobody was going to inspect. Asked Tess if she'd mind being around, casual like, so Karen could see there was somebody looking out for the place. Asked Ricky the same, half joking, half not. Please just be normal. Please don't mention the hospital unless she asks. I rehearsed explanations in my head for the crack in the counter, the size of the kitchen, the heat, like a man cramming for an exam he was going to fail, no matter how he studied. I even thought about buying a few new dish towels, like that would tip the scale somehow, and caught myself at the store holding them and feeling foolish enough to put them back. Karen's skepticism didn't melt the second she stepped off the plane. If anything, it sharpened. She noticed the traffic before we were even out of the airport lot. Noticed the heat pressing down the moment the doors opened, same as I had months before. She walked through the apartment, asking pointed questions. What's the plan if something happens at 3 a.m. again? Who has a key? What's the nearest hospital? How much is all this really costing? Versus what I'd told her on the phone. I didn't have perfect answers for all of it. I gave her the honest ones I had. You scared me half to death, you know that, she said one evening on the balcony, not looking at me, looking out at the street instead. Getting that call from the hospital. I kept thinking, what if I hadn't come? What if you'd been here alone? I've been alone plenty of places, Karen, I said. This wasn't any different. It was different, she said, because this time I couldn't get there in 20 minutes. She let that sit a while before adding, quieter. I'm not saying you made the wrong call moving here. I'm saying I need you to let me worry about you without making me feel crazy for it. I told her I'd try. I don't know that I've fully managed it, even now, but I've gotten better at picking up the phone before she has to hear it from Tom first. She met Ricky the second morning, shook his hand a little stiffly, asked him direct questions about how he got paid for driving me around, whether it was regular, whether I was overpaying him out of guilt. He answered plain, didn't get offended, told her the arrangement was fair on both sides. And I watched her recalibrate something in real time, the way you'd watch someone adjust a scale that had been reading wrong. She met Tess too, walked the building with her, asked about the lease terms Villanueva never gave me properly. And Tess pulled out actual paperwork this time, signed and dated, everything Karen wanted to see. It wasn't dramatic. It was just evidence, stacked up piece by piece, wearing down a wall she'd built out of fear months before I ever boarded that plane. On the third day, I took her out to meet Elena, and she watched me work through a small repair with the boy at my elbow, handing me tools before I asked for them the way an apprentice learns to. And I caught her watching me the way you watch somebody you used to know, reappearing in a person you thought you understood completely. We didn't talk about Tom's debt directly during her visit. Not once, though it sat in the room with us most days like a third person. Nobody wanted to address. I think we both knew there'd be time for that conversation later, once the bigger question, whether I was safe, whether I was being taken care of, had an answer she could live with. It wasn't the apartment that moved anything in her. It was 2 days in, when I missed my usual morning stop at the coffee stand down the block because of an errand that ran long, and by the time we got back, Tess had already knocked twice to check if I was all right, and Ricky had shown up on his bike without being called, just to see why I hadn't been where I usually was. Nobody staged that. Karen stood in the doorway, watching it happen, and I saw something shift in her face. Not approval exactly. More like the ground moving slightly, under a belief she'd been standing on. She didn't say she approved. 2 nights before she flew home, we sat on the little balcony, and she said, "I still don't like it, Dad. I still worry every day." Then, after a while, quieter. But I don't think you're being taken advantage of. Not the way I thought. That was as far as she'd go. She left for the airport the next morning with the question of Tom's debt still sitting between us. Unresolved, and my own independence still something she hadn't fully made peace with. But something had cracked open in her that hadn't been there when she landed, and I carried that back into the apartment with me once her taxi pulled away. Karen called 2 days after she got back to Columbus, and it was a different kind of call than any we'd had in months. Quieter. She said she was still scared, said she'd probably always be a little scared. But she also said she'd been turning it over on the flight home, and she didn't think Villanueva or the hospital or any of it proved what she'd assumed it proved. "You're not being taken advantage of," she said again, like she needed to say it twice to believe it herself. "You're just doing something I wouldn't do. That's different than being a fool about it." I didn't argue with the second half of that sentence. I'd earned some of it. Tom called not long after. First time in almost a year that it was him ringing me instead of the other way around. He sounded smaller than I remembered, the bravado gone out of his voice. Karen must have told him I'd finally said the whole thing out loud, because he didn't dance around it. Said he was ashamed. Said he wanted to start paying some of it back, even if it was slow, even if it was $50 at a time some months. There was a long pause on the line after that, and I could hear him waiting to see if I'd let him off the hook entirely. And I didn't. Not fully. I told him I'd take it. I didn't tell him it was forgiven, because it wasn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But it was something moving instead of something sitting silent between us. And that mattered more than the number did. I asked Tom once, a few calls in, why he'd waited so long to say anything. He was quiet a moment, then said, "Because I figured you'd already written me off, and it was easier to let you than to find out for sure." That one sat with me a while. I don't know that I'd written him off, not really. But I understood how a silence that long could feel that way from the other end of it. We talk most weeks now. Nothing deep most of the time. Just the ordinary back and forth of a father and son catching up. But it's more than we had before, and I don't take it for granted. I sat down at the end of that month and did the real tally, the kind I hadn't let myself do since before Villanueva. Rent. The medication adjustment, which cost more than the first prescription had. The processing fee I'd never see again. What was left afterward wasn't nothing, but it was thinner than I'd first believed it would be, back when the spreadsheet in Ohio had made all this look so clean. I gave up the bigger unit 2 doors down that I'd been eyeing since Tess mentioned it was opening, stayed put instead, cut a streaming subscription I never watched anyway. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a man adjusting his numbers the way he should have adjusted them the whole time, instead of waiting for a crisis to force it. The neighbor with the water pump, Elena, came by again, this time with her son in tow, a boy of maybe 15, who looked at engines the way I once had. Curious, a little afraid of them, not yet trusting his own hands. She asked if I'd show him some of what I knew, not as a favor this time, but as something regular, an afternoon or 2 a week. I said yes before I'd even thought it through, and that surprised me a little, how fast the yes came. It's one thing to fix a stranger's water pump once. It's another to be somebody a kid expects to show up. We started with basics: how to check oil, how to listen for a problem before you can see it. And I found myself explaining things the way I used to explain them to apprentices at the plant. Patient, in a way I hadn't been patient with anything in years. By the 3rd week, he was diagnosing small problems on his own before I could open my mouth, and I felt something close to pride watching it. the kind I hadn't let myself feel about much of anything in a long while. His mother told me once, watching us bent over an engine together on a Saturday afternoon, that he'd started talking about wanting to study mechanical work after school instead of the office job she'd always assumed he'd end up in. I didn't push him toward that. I just answered his questions and let him see that a man could build a decent life with his hands, same as I had, for whatever that was worth to a 15-year-old still figuring out who he wanted to be. It mattered to me more than I let on, being some part of that decision, even a small one. There was a Tuesday morning not long after when I got tied up running an errand for Tess and missed my usual stop at the coffee stand for the first time since Karen's visit. By the time I made it back past noon, 3 separate people had checked on me. The stand owner asking Ricky if he'd seen me, Tess knocking on my door, even the neighbor's boy showing up to ask if our lesson was still on, like my absence had registered as something worth noticing. Nobody made a fuss about it. Nobody needed to. It just happened, the way it happens when you've become a fixture instead of a visitor. I did the math again one evening, not the frightened math from that first week, just the plain kind. What my check bought me here against what it had been buying me on Federal Street, where 3/4 of it disappeared before I'd even opened the fridge. Here it covered the rent, the food, the pills, Ricky's gas money when I needed a ride, a little left over most months for Tom's slow repayment to land against. It wasn't luxury. It was never going to be luxury on a Social Security check. But it was mine to spend instead of a numbersome management company, decided for me twice in 18 months, without ever once asking if I could afford it. I won't pretend it evened out completely. I'm still 11 time zones for my grandkids. There are mornings that gets to me more than I let on to Karen. I still watch my blood pressure closer than I'd like to. Still keep the pill organizer where I can see it, so I don't let it slip again. I still budget close enough that a bad month would hurt. None of that went away. I made this choice with my eyes open to what it costs, not because the costs disappeared. A few nights ago, I was sitting at the kitchen table here, same as I used to sit at the one on Federal Street, and my phone buzzed with the deposit notification. Same alert tone it's always had. I looked at it, then at the electric bill sitting next to it on the table, and did the arithmetic in my head without any of the old dread showing up behind my ribs. It was just numbers. It was just a Tuesday. I still don't know for certain, sitting here now, whether I ran toward this life or ran away from the one that wasn't working anymore. Maybe it doesn't split that clean. What I know is the check finally buys me something more than permission to keep living the life I already had. It buys me a say in it. That's the part nobody explained to me back when I thought this was only about rent. Sometimes I think about what I'd tell the version of myself sitting at that kitchen table in Youngstown 6 months before any of this, staring at a rent notice like it was a verdict on his whole life. I don't know that I'd tell him to go. I don't know that I'd tell him to stay either. I think I'd just tell him the number on that envelope wasn't the only number that mattered, and that it would take him longer than he wanted to understand that. If you made it this far, thank you for sitting with me through all of it. If it meant something to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Leave a comment and tell me what stuck with you, and give it a like on your way out. It helps more than you'd know.